Resolution 2286 must not remain merely aspirational. The international community must ensure its effective implementation and reject selective approaches to address violations of international humanitarian law. In this regard, the government of Sudan, in keeping with its constitutional and national responsibilities to protect civilians in the conflict situation, has developed a national plan for the protection of civilians in time of war and during the peace-building phase. This plan, which is shared with the UN Security Council in February last year, is part of the commitment of the Sudanese government to abide by international law, promote the rule of law, respect human rights, and provide the necessary protection for civilians affected by the armed conflict and the war of aggression being waged against Sudan and the Sudanese people. Sudan hopes that the Security Council supports its efforts in this respect so as to enable it to protect civilians and ensure peace. Mr. President, Sudan also wishes to highlight the growing danger associated with the misuse of emerging military technologies, including drones and other advanced weapon systems increasingly employed in conflict settings. The use of such technologies by non-state actors and militias poses serious risks to civilians and critical infrastructure and threatens regional stability. The international community must strengthen control to prevent the transfer of sophisticated weaponry to non-state actors operating outside legitimate state structures. Mr. President, Sudan underscores that humanitarian action must remain neutral, impartial, and independent, and must be carried out in full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Humanitarian assistance should support national efforts and institutions rather than undermine them. The international community must also invest more seriously in prevention, capacity building, and post-conflict recovery efforts. Protecting civilians requires functioning national institutions, resilient infrastructure, economic recovery, and inclusive political processes. Efforts aimed at sustaining peace must therefore address the developmental and governance dimensions of conflict alongside immediate humanitarian responses. Sudan remains committed to engaging constructively with the United Nations, regional organizations, and international partners to alleviate humanitarian suffering and advance a peaceful future for our people. At the same time, we will call upon the international community to adopt principled and balanced approaches that condemn all violations against civilians without double standards and that respect the sovereignty and legitimate institutions of member states. In conclusion, Mr. President, protecting civilians is not only a legal obligation, it is also a moral and collective responsibility. The credibility of the international system depends on our willingness to uphold international humanitarian law consistently and without selectivity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Sudan for the statement. I'll give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this important event, and I also thank both briefers for their valuable insights. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement and the joint statement of the Global Alliance to Spare Water from Armed Conflicts, and the following remarks will be in our national capacity. Mr. President, we have said it before, and let me say it one more time. Even wars have rules. They are there to preserve a bare minimum of humanity. We thank the ICRC, together with the core group of countries, for presenting the global initiative to galvanize political commitment to IHL. We strongly support it. We're distraught by the latest Secretary General report on the protection of civilians, which warns once again of the critical situation of civilians caught in armed conflict. We continue to witness increasing destruction of critical civilian infrastructure. Civilians are left without access to water, food, sanitation, electricity, and healthcare around the globe. This is happening from situations we discuss quite frequently, including in the occupied Palestinian territory, Sudan, Ukraine, to places of silent suffering and forgotten crisis. Children, women, and girls continue to face killings, displacement, sexual violence, and denial of their basic services. These realities are not inevitable consequences of war. They're not failures of law. They're consequences of choices to disregard obligations and ignore humanity. We reaffirm the importance of respecting EVIPA in reducing civilian harm. 10 years after Resolution 2286, which we recalled some days ago, hospitals continue to be bombed, ambulances blocked, and healthcare workers attacked and killed. Let me underline once again, modern warfare too often ignores international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and binding resolutions of this Council. Mr. President, international law is not mere words on paper. It reflects our agreements and our commitments. Enough is enough. Impunity ends with more accountability. Perpetrators must be held accountable, including through international courts, such as the International Criminal Court. We need to do better in investigating and prosecuting the most serious international crimes. We encourage states to accede to Ljubljana, the Hague Convention. We need to stand up for protection of all civilians, including older persons. We know disproportionate risks older persons face during armed conflicts. This includes violence, neglect, and barriers to humanitarian aid. We call on current and future members of the Security Council to ensure that the protection of older persons in conflict receives due attention. In addition, we emphasize also the particular importance of the Geneva List of Principles on the Protection of Water Infrastructure. It is an important practical tool reinforcing the existing obligations under international humanitarian law and provides a concrete guidance on protecting water and water-related infrastructure during armed conflict. Mr. President, to conclude, if violations are the result of choices, accountability must be the consequence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Nepal.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by thanking the Presidency of the People's Republic of China for convening this timely discussion on this important issue. We commend the UN Secretary General for his valuable report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I also wish to thank the distinguished briefers for their substantive briefings. Mr. President, as armed conflicts continue to grow in scale, complexity and intensity across the world, civilians and civilian infrastructure bear the heaviest brunt. From indiscriminate attacks in densely populated areas to the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals and critical civilian infrastructure, the increasing erosion of respect for international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law, has deepened human suffering, triggered unprecedented displacement, aggravated food, energy and water insecurity, and undermined the very foundations of global peace and security, human dignity and development. Deliberate attacks against civilians and unlawful killings, including of women and children, sexual and gender-based violence, abductions, enforced disappearances, starvation, and the use of civilians as human shields continue to recur with impunity. The proliferation of armed non-state actors, cyber threats, climate disasters, and the misuse of emerging technologies, including AI, for misinformation and disinformation have added newer risk to civilian vulnerability. Furthermore, growing geopolitical tensions, mistrust, and global uncertainty have weakened global governance institutions and cooperation in conflict prevention, peaceful resolution of disputes, and effective multilateral action for the maintenance of international peace and security and civilian protection. Mr. President, Nepal unequivocally expresses profound concerns over growing indiscriminate attacks against innocent civilians, medical and humanitarian personnel, and UN peacekeepers. Since the outbreak of conflicts in the West Asia region, one of major destinations for foreign employment for nearly 2 million Nepali migrant workers, one Nepali national has tragically lost his life, while 27 others have sustained injuries. Against this backdrop, let me highlight a few points. First, we must enhance accountability and promote universal respect for international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law, through stronger political commitment, good faith implementation, and inclusive partnership. All parties to conflict should fully comply with their obligations under international law without selectivity. The Security Council should strengthen accountability mechanisms, support fair, independent investigations into grave violations, and ensure that peacekeeping and political missions are equipped with adequate mandates and resources to protect civilians and reinforce peace-building efforts. We also stress the importance of safeguarding civilian infrastructure, including water, health, education, energy, and telecommunication systems from attacks during the armed conflict. Second, the protection of civilians requires addressing the root causes of conflict, including poverty, inequality, exclusion, and injustice. Sustainable peace cannot be achieved without inclusive development, social justice, and respect for human dignity. While the primary responsibility to protect civilians lies with the states, the international community, including the UN and humanitarian agencies, should continue supporting peaceful resolution of conflicts and humanitarian assistance in line with the UN Charter and international law. Third, preventive diplomacy, mediation, and inclusive political processes remain essential tools to prevent escalation of conflicts and civilian suffering. We need to support a nationally led peace process and regional conflict prevention initiatives, promote dialogue, confidence-building measures, and participation of women, youth, and local communities at peace negotiation table. Nepal's inclusive, nationally owned, and nationally led peace process stands as exemplary model of successful conflict transformation. As one of the largest troop and police contributing countries, Nepal remains firmly committed to the implementation of UN peacekeeping mandates on protection of civilians. Fourth, we must foster global solidarity and cooperation to promote a responsible use of emerging technologies and prevent their weaponization in conflict situations. The international community should work toward co-designing global norms, safeguards, and ethical standards governing military applications of such technologies to avert misuse that could fuel violence, hatred, misinformation, and instability. Technology should serve the cause of humanity and peace, not destruction and division. Finally, strengthening humanitarian access and partnership is critical. We stress the need to facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access in collaboration with the UN system, government, and local humanitarian actors. Mr. President, the protection of civilians is both a legal obligation and a moral imperative of the international community. The stark realities facing vulnerable communities, nations, and regions in armed conflict call for strengthened multilateralism, mutual trust, and global cooperation to deliver the pledges of international humanitarian law and to ensure that civilians never become the victims of political failure or impunity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Nepal. I give the floor to the representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I congratulate China for assuming the presidency of the Security Council and commend its leadership in convening this open debate at the critical juncture when the international legal obligation to protect civilians in armed conflicts is being undermined at unprecedented levels. Cambodia, having endured decades of civil war, understands well the devastation and suffering inflicted upon civilians, particularly women and children. In this regard, my delegation wishes to make the following observations. First, the protection of civilians in both international and national and international arms conflicts must be ensured through full respect of international law, the UN charters, relevant Security Council's resolutions, and particularly the international humanitarian law. Attacks against civilian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and World Heritage Culture sites constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. Such acts must be prevented, condemned, and never condoned. Second, the core principle of IHL's distinctions, proportionality, precautions, and humanity must be upheld In all circumstances, both state and non-state actors are obliged to conduct hostility in a manner that protects civilians, preserves human dignities, and minimize unnecessary sufferings. These are binding obligations under treaty and customary international law. Third, violation of IHL continue to occur across many regions, including Southeast Asia. In Cambodia, the unprovoked acts of aggression in July and December 2025 resulted in significant humanitarian consequences, displacing more than 649,000 civilians. Currently, approximately 32,160 people remain displaced, while numerous homes and property have been destroyed. In addition, the Temple of Pravihir, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, sustained extensive damage. Mr. President, the protection of civilians is binding obligation upon all parties to conflict. The international community, particularly the Security Council, must take timely and decisive action to ensure compliance with international law and IHLs. Lest the credibility of the Council primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security be undermined. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cambodia. I now give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
President, we'd like to thank the People's Republic of China for convening this important annual debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We appreciate the Secretary-General's report and we take note of its recommendations. We also would like to extend our thanks to the briefers for their important contributions. We further recognize the work of those who operate under increasingly difficult conditions to protect people affected by armed conflict and alleviate their suffering. The Dominican Republic aligns itself with the statement delivered by Ireland on behalf of the Group of Friends on Action Against Hunger and Conflict and by Switzerland on behalf of the Group of Friends on the Protection of Civilians. Mr. President, the reality we face, and which has been reiterated in today's and yesterday's statements, presents a deeply troubling picture. Civilians continue to be the primary victims of armed conflict, facing food insecurity, forced displacement, and the deterioration of the conditions necessary to live in safety and dignity. In light of this reality, the Dominican Republic reiterates its call for full respect for international humanitarian law. The protection of civilians requires political will and the effective implementation of existing norms at all times and in all contexts by all parties to a conflict. One issue of continuing importance is the link between armed conflict, hunger, and food insecurity. This year marks 8 years since the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2417, through which this Council recognized the relationship that exists between armed conflict and hunger. In 2020, under the leadership of the Dominican Republic, this Council adopted Presidential Statement 2020-6, which provided renewed momentum by emphasizing the importance of early warning systems in facilitating a timely response. That responsibility remains urgent. It is not enough to simply receive information about a worsening crisis if we are unable to act in time. This Council has the tools to identify risks, prevent their escalation, and promote coordinated responses before hunger, violence, and the collapse of essential services become disasters. However, much still remains to be done. Hunger continues to be used as a method of war, and objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population continue to be attacked, destroyed, or prevented from functioning. Therefore, we must renew our commitment to the full implementation of Resolution 2417 as well as Resolution 2573. Prevention must occupy a central place in the work of this Council. We need to strengthen early warning systems, mitigate the effects of conflicts on affected communities, protect their livelihoods, and support responses that integrate humanitarian action, development, and peace building. The protection of civilians does not begin when a crisis has already reached its most severe point. It begins when we decide to act before it's too late. Mr. President, peacekeeping operations and special political missions with civilian protection mandates must be provided with adequate resources, clear mandates and sustained political support. If this Council entrusts a mission with the responsibility of protecting civilians, it must also ensure that it has the means necessary to carry out that mandate. A lack of resources should not weaken the protection of those who depend on the presence of the United Nations in the field. We also wish to highlight the essential work of humanitarian personnel and United Nations personnel, including local and national staff. Their work enables assistance to reach those who need it most and must be respected, protected and facilitated at all times. Mr. President, in conclusion, the Dominican Republic reaffirms that the protection of civilians requires political will, compliance with international law and timely action. We cannot accept the normalization of civilian suffering in armed conflicts. The lives and dignity of civilians must remain at the center of our collective action. Thank you very much.
感谢多米尼。
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic. I now give the floor to the representative of Mauritania.
أود في البداية أن أشكر الرئاسة الصينية لمجلس الأمن.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to congratulate China for this open debate on a subject of major importance. I'd also like to thank the Secretary General for his report, which highlights the issue of the protection of civilians. We'd also like to thank other speakers for their statements. President, members of the Council, our world today is seeing a worrying number of conflicts and wars. That's why we have dual responsibility within the Security Council, pursuant to the United Nations Charter, to maintain international peace and security. This Council must deploy efforts to address these conflicts in a peaceful manner, finding political solutions through mediation, for example, and good offices and in accordance with Article 33 of the Charter. The Council must always guarantee protection of civilians during periods of armed conflict, be that when it is looking for solutions to conflicts or at times of intervention pursuant to Article 7 to maintain international peace and security. Protecting civilians in armed conflict is a common responsibility, and it is a fundamental rule of international law and international humanitarian law. And the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, all of these apply. Resolution 2256 of the Council stresses the need for all parties to a conflict to respect international law, particularly international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to not ensure that civilians are not targeted, and also protect most vulnerable groups such as women, children and those with disabilities. And the resolution also stresses the need to ensure that humanitarian assistance is delivered. And the Council must ensure that all of these standards are applied. The same is true of Resolution 2286. This clearly shows the need to protect humanitarian workers and medical workers. My country, President, Mauritania, as part of our international commitments, attaches particular importance to the protection of civilians in situations of armed conflict. We have contributed to peacekeeping missions, whilst respecting the mandate as it pertains to the protection of civilians. We have also worked against violence against children and sexual and gender-based violence. We're also working alongside the United Nations and other UN agencies in the area of the maintenance of international peace and security. Over the last 3 years, President, we have seen an unprecedented genocide take place. More than 70,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli war machine, the majority of them women, children and elderly persons, totally defenseless, and the war has targeted civilian infrastructure and journalists and humanitarian workers. 408 humanitarian workers have been killed since 2023, and numerous workers from UNRWA in Lebanon as well. During operations that began in March 2026, thousands of civilians have been killed, the majority of them innocent, defenseless civilians. President, concluding, as we celebrate the week of protection of civilians, we once again call upon the international community and the Security Council to ensure that international humanitarian law is respected and that civilians and the infrastructure is not taken as a target. This is an absolute priority, and this is something that must be taken into account in all conflicts without any selectivity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mauritania. I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia joins others in congratulating China on its presidency of the Security Council. We thank the briefers for their insights and commend the Council's continued commitment to this important matter. Mr. President, the Secretary General's latest report paints a deeply troubling picture of the continued suffering endured by civilians in armed conflict. Civilians continue to bear the brunt of hostilities through indiscriminate attacks, forced displacement, hunger, destruction of vital infrastructure, and restricted access to humanitarian assistance. Particularly alarming is the continued erosion of respect for international humanitarian law and the increasing normalization of civilian harm. In this respect, Malaysia wishes to highlight several key points. First, greater emphasis must be placed on conflict prevention. Lasting protection of civilians can only be achieved through dialogue, diplomacy, and addressing the root causes of instability in accordance with the UN Charter. Ultimately, preventing and ending armed conflict is the most effective way to protect civilians. Second, increased attention must also be given to enhancing compliance with international law by all parties to armed conflict. Malaysia reiterates that violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, particularly attacks targeting civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel, must face consequences. International accountability mechanisms and tribunals continue to play a vital role in upholding justice and ending impunity. Without accountability, violations persist and efforts to protect civilians are ultimately undermined. Third, Malaysia also notes with concern the growing implications arising from the use of emerging technologies in armed conflict, including artificial intelligence, drones, and information and communications technology, including social media. While such technologies may offer greater opportunities to protect civilians, their indiscriminate use in conflict presents serious humanitarian, legal, and ethical concerns. The use of such technologies in conflict must strictly comply with international law, including international humanitarian law. Finally, Malaysia considers UN peacekeeping operations as a critical pillar in the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Despite increasingly complex operational environments and resource constraints, peacekeeping missions continue to provide vital protection and support to vulnerable civilian populations. As a long-standing contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, Malaysia currently deploys more than 500 personnel from the Malaysian Armed Forces and the Royal Malaysia Police across 5 peacekeeping missions. Mr. President, to conclude, the protection of civilians remains a collective responsibility that requires genuine political will, consistent application of international law, and strengthened multilateral cooperation. The Security Council must continue to act in a fair, credible and consistent manner in preventing and addressing situations involving civilian harm. Malaysia remains committed to working constructively with all member states towards ensuring the safety, dignity, and protection of civilians affected by armed conflict. I thank you.
感谢马来西亚代表。
I thank the representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for organizing this debate on an issue of utmost urgency and moral imperative. I would also like to express our appreciation to the briefers for their insightful remarks. Cyprus aligns with the statement made by the EU, but wishes to make some remarks in its national capacity. The suffering caused by today's conflict calls for urgent and decisive action. There is an urgent need to reaffirm respect for international law, including the UN Charter, and to strengthen compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law. This is not only a legal imperative, it is fundamental to our shared humanity. The Council must make full use of all tools at its disposal to ensure the protection of civilians. To this end, Cyprus wishes to highlight the following. Number one, the global number of forcibly displaced persons continues to rise at an alarming rate. Situations of protracted displacement are particularly concerning, and we firmly believe that the Council should undertake more robust action to ensure the swift and effective implementation of the right to return. This includes ensuring respect for the property rights of displaced individuals and prohibiting the illegal settlement in areas from which people have been forcibly displaced. Cyprus, itself a victim of the illegal Turkish military invasion and continuing Turkish occupation, is fully cognizant of the severe impact that displacement has on civilian lives. Number two, the humanitarian dimension of the issue of missing persons cannot be ignored. A significant number of individuals remain missing as a result of armed conflict. Families are entitled to know the fate of their loved ones. The anguish endured by families is profound, and the lack of answers only prolongs and deepens their grief. There is a pressing need to strengthen international cooperation mechanisms to address this issue more effectively. We call on the Security Council to build upon Resolution 2474 of 2019 and to incorporate more robust provisions in its future resolutions, particularly in protracted cases where the fate and whereabouts of missing persons have remained unknown for decades, as is the case in Cyprus. Number three, the protection of humanitarian and UN personnel must remain a priority for the Security Council's agenda. We welcome the adoption of Resolution 2730 of 2024 in this regard and call for its full implementation. We also underscore the critical importance of ensuring rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access in all conflict-affected areas. Mr. President, before concluding, I would like to commend the indispensable humanitarian work carried out by the ICRC around the world and to reaffirm our deep gratitude for the support it has provided to the people of Cyprus. Lastly, allow me, Mr. President, to refer to the intervention of the Turkish permanent representative and reject in toto the unfounded allegations made with regard to the Turkish Cypriots. The immense destruction and suffering caused by the Turkish military invasion and subsequent occupation of Cyprus is well documented in UN archives. Mr. President, the responsibility to protect civilians is a shared responsibility of all states. All member states must take steps to prevent the targeting of civilians and to ensure the implementation of international humanitarian law. The message must be clear. No military objectives justifies the deliberate harm of innocent lives, and those who perpetrate crimes against humanity must be held accountable. I thank you.
感谢塞浦路斯代表。
I thank the representative of Cyprus. I now give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We thank China for organizing this annual open debate on the protection of civilians. We also wish to thank the briefers for their presentations and testimonies, which paint a devastating picture of the situation on the ground. And we commend all humanitarian actors for their courage and continued efforts in extremely difficult situations. Luxembourg fully aligns itself with the statements of the European Union and by the Group of Friends on the Protection of Civilians, and would like to add the following. While the Secretary General's report notes a general decrease in the number of civilian casualties, the reality remains nonetheless alarming. Every 14 minutes, a civilian loses their life due to armed conflict. More than 130 conflicts are currently ongoing, which is a record number since the creation of the UN. Our thoughts are with civilian populations and the loved ones of victims killed, whether in Gaza on the West Bank, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ukraine, Myanmar, or elsewhere in the world. Let us be clear, respect for international humanitarian law is not optional. It constitutes a legal obligation for all parties to an armed conflict and reflects the minimum protection that must be afforded to civilians and other protected persons. In practice, international humanitarian law is often ignored and violated in a context of increasing impunity. Mr. President, international law, including international humanitarian law, is one of the most powerful tools at our disposal to guarantee the protection and dignity of one and all. And in this context, we underline the importance of the Global Initiative on International Humanitarian Law, in which Luxembourg co-chairs Working Group number 6 on the use of digital technologies in armed conflict, together with Ghana, Mexico, Switzerland, and the ICRC. As the Secretary General highlights in his report, developments in the digital domain pose considerable challenges for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Cyber operations can cause damage without human involvement or the use of traditional weapons. These new weapons and methods of warfare must not be developed and deployed in a legal vacuum. International humanitarian law must remain applicable, and human control over the use of force must be preserved. Mr. President, the humanitarian context is further complicated by significant budget cuts, making the work of humanitarian actors even more difficult. Luxembourg is and will remain a strong, reliable, and consistent partner for these actors. And in this regard, Luxembourg will support the efforts of the ICRC, one of its most important humanitarian partners, with a total contribution of 6.6 million euros per year for the period 2026-2029. In addition to financial contributions, and with a view to leveraging Luxembourg's capabilities and expertise to help meet growing humanitarian needs, Luxembourg has been proud to host an ICRC cyberspace delegation since November 2022. Luxembourg also welcomes the high-level conference on humanity in war, which will take place in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on the 7th December 2026. Allow me also to highlight our partnership with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, which Luxembourg supports with an amount in excess of 13 million euros in 2026, including contributions to common funds and the SURF. Our contributions are predictable and regular, thus enabling OCHA to continue its efforts to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to the most vulnerable civilian populations in accordance with the principles of international humanitarian law. In conclusion, Mr. President, Luxembourg remains committed to advancing the protection of civilians and the prevention of atrocities, including through our co-chairmanship of the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to congratulate China on assuming the presidency and extend my deep appreciation to you for convening this annual open debate. I also thank the briefers for their remarks. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report showed the widening gap between global commitments to protect civilians in armed conflict and the reality they faced. The UN recorded more than 37,000 civilian deaths across 20 armed conflicts in 2025. Conflicts in just 5 countries, including my country, Myanmar, accounted for 65% of all new displacements in the first half. 10 years since the adoption of Resolution 2286, attacks against medical personnel and facilities remain a feature of many conflicts. Against this backdrop, we, member states of the UN, must exercise bold leadership, renew political will, and decisive actions to reinforce compliance with international humanitarian law and enhance accountability for perpetrators so that we could live up to our promises to protect civilians in armed conflicts around the world. Accordingly, Myanmar joined the joint commitment to uphold the protections of civilians amidst reforms and constraints which was issued today. I thank Switzerland for its leadership in this regard. Mr. President, impunity in one conflict setting can embolden perpetrators in another conflict setting. The Security Council and the international community have a shared responsibility to uphold protections of civilians in all conflict settings, regardless of their degree of international attention. In this regard, I wish to thank the Secretary General for particularly highlighting the protracted conflict in Myanmar in his report, including indiscriminate area attacks, banning of villages and farmland, attacks on healthcare and connectivity disruption committed by the military junta. Since the illegal coup, over 8,000 people have been killed by the military. 3.6 million people have been displaced and almost 22 million are in need of humanitarian assistance. Given this deteriorating situation, the Security Council and the international community, in our view, can undertake the following concrete measures to ensure effective and sustained protections of civilians in Myanmar. First, applying appropriate pressures on the military junta. The indiscriminate act of committing all forms of violence by the military is a clear violation of the UN resolutions, including the Security Council Resolution 2669 and the GA Resolution 75/287 and ASEAN 5-point consensus. Such repeated violations clearly demand a follow-up resolution by the Council and further comprehensive measures by member states to prevent the flow of arms, weapons, jet fuel, dual-use items and technologies to the military junta. Statements expressing concern have not deterred the military from indiscriminate airstrike against civilians and civilian infrastructure. At the same time, hasty and unwarranted attempts to engage bilaterally or regionally with the military junta will not stop the military from further committing more war crimes and crimes against humanity. Second, strengthening accountability mechanisms for perpetrators. The deliberate act of committing international crimes has brought the military junta and its leadership under relevant international accountability mechanisms, including the case of the Gambia versus Myanmar at the ICJ and an application of arrest warrant against Senior General Min Aung Hlaing by the ICC prosecutor, among others. Accordingly, the Security Council can bridge the institutional gap in accountability and refer the situation of Myanmar to the ICC to bring justice and end the culture of impunity enjoined by the military junta. Without justice for victims, sustainable solution cannot be found, and the transitional justice will guarantee protections of civilians and deter reoccurrence of violations of international law. Third, and last, addressing the root cause of conflict. The long-standing act of committing civilian harm by the military poses the greatest threat to civilians in Myanmar. The people of Myanmar are fully aware that this threat will remain existential as long as the military junta enjoys political and institutional impunity in our country. This nominal change in the military junta and their titles does not signal an institutional or systematic political change, nor does it signal a genuine commitment to peace and stability. Therefore, the international community should seriously pay attention to the aspirations of our people instead and take a comprehensive approach in addressing the situation in Myanmar for sustainable peace and stability. In conclusion, Mr. President,
Civilians must be protected. It is not only our obligation, but also our moral duty. As such, Myanmar reaffirms our commitment to existing legal obligations under international humanitarian law and protections of civilians. The National Unity Government and major ethnic democratic forces in Myanmar are coordinating through the Steering Council for the emergence of a federal democratic union to bring the military under civilian oversight and institute a system of transitional justice to achieve justice and accountability for victims of injustice during the conflict period. As such, I urge the international community to extend effective support to the people of Myanmar and the SCEF in our collective efforts to eradicate the military dictatorship and build a federal democratic union for protections of civilians. Thank you, Mr. President.
感谢缅甸代表的。
I thank the representative of Myanmar for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. We take note of the Secretary General's report on the protection of civilians and thank Ms. Wasurno and Ms. Poljarek for their comprehensive and sobering briefings yesterday. Mr. President, Excellencies, civilians in conflict zones continue to bear the brunt of armed conflict. Lives are lost, families separated and displaced, health systems decimated, humanitarian spaces eroded, infrastructure destroyed, food insecurity exacerbates, and vulnerability to sexual violence increases. These dire consequences are exacerbated by climate change and other destabilizing social and economic factors, often symptomatic of conflict zones. The protection of civilians must, therefore, remain at the center of the international community's efforts to achieve global peace and security. Too many lives have been lost and continues to be lost. The deliberate targeting of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and medical professionals, coupled with the evolving nature of warfare, necessitates a collective response which is grounded in international law. The adoption of Resolution 1265 in 1999 signaled the international community's recognition of and commitment to the protection of civilians during armed conflicts and underscored the necessity of compliance with international humanitarian law, including as codified in the Geneva Conventions. Since then, several Council products and other instruments have contributed to a robust framework for the protection of civilians in armed conflict. But much more needs to be done for their full implementation. As we survey conflicts across the globe, we are particularly concerned by the situation in Haiti, a member of our own sub-region. For too long, civilians in Haiti have been grappling with gang violence that affects every aspect of their lives and which has essentially frozen development efforts. We urge the international community to intensify its support to the Haitian people so that they can urgently move past this difficult chapter. In light of the foregoing, we recommend the following. First, addressing the political, economic, social, and environmental drivers that give rise to conflict is key to its prevention. We must prioritize measures which address, inter alia, inequality, corruption, resource competition, and climate vulnerability, and thus reduce the incentives for violence. The participation of all key actors in the development of conflict prevention is critical. Second, there must be strict adherence to international law, including international humanitarian law. International law must not be interpreted and applied selectively. All parties to conflict have a legal obligation for the protection of civilians in conflicts. Accountability is a necessary step to deter violations. CARICOM urges countries to take measures to ensure accountability for violations. This imperative includes initiating transparent investigations and prosecutions of those responsible for causing them and them undue harm. Third, CARICOM urges deliberate measures to increase the protection of health workers, including through deconfliction, the establishment of humanitarian corridors for medical personnel, facilities and transportation, and accountability for attacks on medical workers and facilities. The frequency and severity of attacks against medical personnel and facilities warrant this, since these attacks deprive entire communities of life-saving care and undermine long-term recovery. It is alarming that the majority of these attacks are carried out by state actors. Fourth, the advent of artificial intelligence and its misuse in conflict zones presents a challenge for global peace, which the United Nations must continue to address. The responsible and ethical use of AI can be helpful in peace-building and peacekeeping efforts, reducing AI-driven threats, including those targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, colleagues, CARICOM urges the Security Council to work collaboratively with the General Assembly and other relevant bodies to uphold international law regarding the treatment of all civilians, including medical professionals and infrastructure in conflict situations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to Morocco.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, at the outset, allow me to express Morocco's appreciation to the Chinese Presidency of the Security Council for convening this timely, open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The Secretary General's report 390 of this year presents a grim reality. In 2025 alone, the UN documented more than 37,000 civilian deaths across 20 armed conflicts, amounting to one civilian death approximately every 14 minutes. Civilians continue to suffer from indiscriminate attacks, starvation, siege tactics, forced displacement, sexual violence, destruction of essential infrastructure, and denial of humanitarian assistance. Hospitals, schools, water systems, and energy facilities are increasingly targeted or damaged, depriving millions of civilians of the basic conditions necessary for survival and dignity. Morocco strongly condemns all attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The Kingdom of Morocco reiterates that the protection of civilians is a moral, a political, and a binding legal obligation. Mr. President, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 2286 on the protection of medical care in armed conflicts. Yet, as highlighted in the Secretary General's report, attacks against healthcare facilities and medical personnel have dramatically increased since the adoption of that resolution. Morocco calls for the full implementation of Resolution 2286 and for strengthened accountability mechanisms. Similarly, the increase in attacks against humanitarian workers, UN personnel, are deeply concerning. Humanitarian actors must be allowed to carry out their life-saving work safely, impartially, and independently. Mr. President, Morocco firmly believes that protecting civilians requires addressing both the immediate consequences and the driving causes of conflict. First, we stress that the protection of civilians is primarily the responsibility of the state. National ownership remains essential. At the same time, UN peacekeeping operations can play an important complementary role where mandated and adequately resourced. As a long-time troop contributing country to UN peacekeeping missions with a POC mandate, Moroccan peacekeepers and contingents are systematically trained to uphold the protection of civilians' mandates according to the UN-established standards. Second, Morocco advocates for a comprehensive approach to peace building that integrates socio-economic development, youth employment, women and girls empowerment, access to education, healthcare, sanitation, and infrastructure development. The protection of civilians must therefore be integrated into broader efforts aimed at sustaining peace and addressing the structural drivers of violence. Third, new and emerging technologies are profoundly reshaping the conduct of warfare and generating new risks for the civilians. Morocco recognizes the transformative potential of artificial intelligence and digital innovation, including for humanitarian response, early warning systems, and civilian protection, while urges that these technologies must be governed responsibly in full compliance with international law. Finally, the rise of misinformation and disinformation and also hate speech fuel polarization, incitement and violence, and undermine trust in humanitarian organizations and place civilians and humanitarian workers at greater risk. Morocco reiterates its long-standing commitment to combating hate speech and intolerance, namely through its leadership in promoting General Assembly Resolution 73/328 and subsequent resolutions on this issue. In conclusion, the Kingdom of Morocco underlines that the protection of civilians requires concrete action, political courage, and unwavering respect for international law. Morocco remains fully committed to working with all member states to strengthen the protection of civilians, advance peaceful solutions to conflicts, support humanitarian action, and promote a more just, humane, and rules-based international order. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Morocco for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
My delegation thanks China for convening this important and timely open debate. 27 years ago, this Council adopted its first resolution on the protection of civilians, establishing POC as a thematic item in this chamber. And 5 years ago, during Vietnam's presidency, the Council also adopted Resolution 2573 on the protection of objects indispensable to the survival of civilian population in armed conflict. Yet, despite a robust legal and normative framework under international humanitarian law and relevant Security Council resolutions, the reality remains deeply troubling. Across conflicts worldwide, homes, schools, hospitals, water systems, and humanitarian relief operations continue to come under attack. Legal commitments on paper do not automatically protect civilians on the ground. For Vietnam, this topic reminds us of the painful memories of our own history, when residential areas in many parts of the country were devastated by bombardment. Warfare today may involve more advanced and sophisticated technologies, but one truth remains unchanged. Civilians always bear the heaviest cost of war. The challenge before us is therefore not the absence of law, but the lack of full compliance, implementation, and accountability. In this regard, Vietnam fully supports the Secretary General's recommendations in his 2026 report and wishes to highlight the following 4 priorities. First, we must strengthen compliance with international humanitarian law in actual operations. The principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution must be fully integrated into military planning and rules of engagement, supported by practical training for all parties involved in conflict. Second, technology must serve humanity. Emerging technologies, including AI and autonomous systems, should help reduce civilian harm and protect critical infrastructure, not intensify destruction. Third, the protection of civilians must remain central to peacekeeping operations and special political missions. Even amid financial constraints, POC mandates must receive adequate financing and support. Budgetary savings at the expense of civilian protection today may cost many more lives tomorrow. Fourth, the Security Council should reinforce its oversight role through more regular and context-specific monitoring in high-risk situations to ensure that relevant resolutions are respected and implemented on the ground. Mr. President, Vietnam reaffirms its steadfast commitment to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict. We stand ready to work with all member states, the United Nations, the ICRC, and humanitarian partners to ensure that international humanitarian law is not only reaffirmed, but effectively implemented where it matters the most, on the ground. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank
Mr. President. The Holy See delegation would like to thank China for convening this important open debate. In recent years, civilians have continued to suffer the tragic consequences of armed conflict on a vast scale. Millions have been displaced from their homes, while many others remain exposed to violence, hunger, insecurity, and the collapse of essential services. Despite concerted efforts to impose limits on warfare and strengthen the protections under international humanitarian law, innocent and defenseless civilians continue to bear the brunt of conflict. Protection of civilians is not merely a political or operational concern. As Pope Leo XIV affirms, the principle of humanity, inscribed in the conscience of every person and recognized in international law, entails a moral obligation to protect the civilian population from the horrific effects of war. For this reason, the Holy See is gravely concerned by the growing disregard for international humanitarian law and by the normalization of conduct that places civilians increasingly at risk. In this regard, my delegation would like to draw attention to three key issues. Firstly, attacks on places of worship and religious communities are gravely concerning. Such actions wound not only individual believers, but also the cultural, spiritual, and social fabric of entire communities. Furthermore, in times of conflict, such sites become places of refuge, providing assistance and fostering solidarity. Therefore, ensuring freedom of religion, even amidst conflict, is essential for safeguarding human dignity and promoting reconciliation. Secondly, there is an urgent need to protect medical personnel and facilities. Despite the fact that a decade has passed since the adoption of Resolution 2286, attacks on hospitals, ambulances, and healthcare workers continue to be alarming. Those who are wounded or sick must never be denied care, and those who provide humanitarian assistance must never be targeted. Thirdly, the growing role of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, in warfare is a matter for concern. The use of technology must always be grounded in ethical responsibility, since no machine can replace the moral judgment required when human lives are at stake. Indeed, the use of technologies lacking meaningful human control risks further distancing decision-makers from the human consequences of war and weakening accountability for the protection of civilian life. Mr. President, the Holy See reiterates its call for all parties to armed conflicts to fully respect international humanitarian law and protect civilian populations. At the same time, the international community must intensify its efforts aimed at prevention, dialogue, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, recognizing that authentic peace is built not through fear or destruction, but through encounter, trust, and responsibility. As Pope Leo XIV observed, peace begins with each of us, in the way we look at others, listen to others, and speak about others. This appeal is particularly significant at a time when the language and logic of war reduce persons to numbers, enemies, or collateral damage. Protecting civilians entails the refusal to treat people as mere objects or numbers, and instead recognize the God-given dignity of every human person, even in times of conflict. Thank you, Mr. President.
感谢罗马教廷常驻。
Thank the representative of the permanent observer mission of the Holy See for the statement. I'd now give the floor to the representative of Angola.
Distinguished member of the Security Council, Excellencies, Angola thanks the People's Republic of China for its leadership and for convening this meeting, and all briefer for the important contribution to this debate yesterday. Protection of civilians in armed conflict constitutes a non-derogable legal obligation enshrined in the international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and in the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter itself. The Geneva Convention and its additional protocols is the central legal basis for the protection of non-combatants against internal and international conflicts. The fact that attacks against civilians remain alarmingly high shows that such norms, although clear, continue to be systematically violated. Mr. President, allow me to address three key challenges confronting us today. First, deficient compliance with existing international norms. The primary challenge is not the lack of law, but poor compliance by states and non-state actors. Effective protection of civilians in armed conflicts requires that the Security Council exercise its mandate with legal coherence and political unity and ensure that full implementation of Resolution 2286 and 2573. The protection of civilians cannot be subject to selectivity or instrumentalization. It constitutes an erga omnes obligation, the fulfillment of which is in the interest of the international community. Second, addressing sensitive challenge posed by urban warfare. The use of explosive weapons like missiles and drones in urban populated areas cause high level of civilian death, injury, and damage to critical infrastructure. We are witnessing regular attacks on civilian infrastructure, bombing of homes, schools, hospitals, and institutions crucial to the survival of the population, in clear violation of protection of civilians laws. The increase in indiscriminate attacks and the disproportionate violation against humanitarian workers constitute grave violation of the Geneva Convention and their additional protocols. 10 years after the adoption of the Resolution 2286, we express our serious concern over the intensification of attacks against medical facilities, medical personnel, and transport in blatant violation of the principle of special protection accorded to the health service in armed conflicts. Third, emerging technology. The rise of autonomous weapon systems, artificial intelligence, and cyber operation creates risks of harm without human oversight and blurs the lines between civilians and military targets. These challenges can not only be overcome collectively and through an unequivocal commitment to protecting human life, regardless of the nature of the conflicts, in the interest of all actors involved. The protection of civilians requires more than condemnation. It demands the effective and unselected implementation of existing norms. Before concluding, Mr. President, we would like to share 3 suggestions to counter current challenges going forward. Number 1, strengthen legal accountability to ensure that grave violations of international humanitarian law do not go unpunished, including through international investigative mechanisms and competent courts. Number 2, promote strict adherence to the principle of distinction, proportionality, and the precaution which governs the conduct of hostilities. Third, support effective states in strengthening the national protection capacities, including through technical assistance, institutional development, and preventive measures. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Republic of Angola reiterates its commitment to compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights law, promoting social development and global security strategy. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Angola for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Guatemala welcomes the convening of this open debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. We highlight the usefulness of the concept note as well as the value of the Secretary-General's report and the briefings by the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the International Committee of the Red Cross. Taken together, they demonstrate that the protection of civilians is not facing a crisis of norms, but rather a crisis of compliance. The normative framework exists, the mechanisms exist, yet the gap between our commitments and the reality on the ground continues to widen. 10 years on from the adoption of Resolution 2286, attacks against healthcare not only persist but continue to increase, demonstrating a troubling normalization of these violations of international humanitarian law. In a context of increasingly numerous and complex conflicts, civilians continue to bear the greatest burden of violence, while essential services and critical infrastructure are systematically affected. In this regard, we express deep concern over the increase in attacks against healthcare and humanitarian personnel. We underscore the importance of this Council exercising leadership to help reverse this trend. As a country that has experienced an internal armed conflict, Guatemala knows firsthand the human cost of failing to protect the civilian population. This experience compels us to insist that respect for international humanitarian law must be translated into concrete actions on the ground. Mr. President, allow me to highlight 3 priority areas. Firstly, strengthening accountability. Impunity remains one of the principal factors perpetuating these violations. Second, advancing the systematic integration of civilian protection into the planning and conduct of military operations, including preventive measures and best practices that help reduce harm before it occurs. Thirdly, recognizing that risks are evolving. New technologies and the transformation of conflicts pose additional challenges that require adapted responses. Mr. President, protecting civilians requires more than expressing concern. It requires leadership, it requires political will, and it requires sustained and consistent action, including within the framework of this Council's work. The protection of civilians can no longer remain merely a declaratory principle. It must become an operational and measurable criterion that guides the decisions of the Security Council. Guatemala reiterates its commitment to strengthening international humanitarian law and calls for renewed efforts to ensure its effective implementation, as well as to address the factors that allow these violations to persist. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of El Salvador.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, the persistence and scale of the suffering endured by civilian populations in armed conflicts renews the need for a determined response from this Council. We therefore thank the Presidency of China for convening this important debate and the distinguished briefers for their presentations. Mr. President, armed conflicts in 2025 continued to be characterized by alarming levels of harm to civilian populations. The figures we are looking at today, though shocking, represent only a fraction of the reality due to limitations in access and verification. In light of this situation, El Salvador reiterates its strongest condemnation of all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The normative framework built over decades to protect civilians cannot continue to be eroded. It must be preserved and it must be strengthened. In this regard, we call upon the Security Council to fully discharge its mandate, and we call upon member states and parties to conflicts to commit themselves decisively to the effective protection of civilian populations. El Salvador has supported concrete initiatives in this area and urges other states to do likewise. In particular, we emphasize the need to strengthen support for the Declaration on the Use of Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, given that the use of missiles, bombs, and other explosive devices in urban environments remains one of the principal causes of harm to civilians. Likewise, we reaffirm our support for the framework of international humanitarian law, including fundamental instruments such as the Convention on the Prohibition of Anti-Personnel Mines. Mr. President, 10 years after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2286, the increase in attacks against medical facilities and medical personnel is deeply concerning. Restoring respect for the medical mission must be an urgent priority for this Council and for all states. Similarly, We strongly condemn attacks against humanitarian personnel and call for measures to ensure their protection, including through adherence to initiatives such as the Political Declaration on the Protection of Humanitarian Personnel. Mr. President, as a contributor of military troops and police forces, El Salvador reaffirms the importance of preserving and strengthening civilian protection mandates in peace operations. In a context of significant financial constraints, it is essential to prevent budget cuts from weakening the ability of missions to fulfill their responsibilities. On the contrary, we must redouble our efforts to ensure that they have the resources and tools necessary to respond to growing threats against civilian populations. Mr. President, information and communications technologies, emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, and the use of unmanned aerial vehicles are transforming the conduct of conflicts, creating additional risks for civilians and challenging existing normative frameworks. We are particularly concerned about their impact on children who face new forms of violence, including recruitment, manipulation, and exposure to attacks facilitated by these technologies. According to the most recent data from this organization, the situation of girls and boys affected by armed conflict continues to deteriorate. In 2024, more than 41,000 grave violations against children were verified, including nearly 12,000 cases of children killed or maimed, many of whom suffered permanent disabilities resulting from the use of explosive weapons, landmines, and attacks on civilian infrastructure. These figures reflect not only the devastating physical impact of armed conflicts, but also the profound psychosocial consequences and the growing needs for rehabilitation, inclusion, and protection for thousands of affected children. In this regard, there is an urgent need to address these challenges comprehensively, ensuring that the development and use of these tools are governed by international law and that they prioritize the protection of civilian populations. Mr. President, the protection of civilians is not just a legal obligation, but also a moral imperative. For El Salvador, it also constitutes an unavoidable commitment that guides our actions in the multilateral sphere, including our contribution to peace operations and our support for initiatives aimed at its full implementation. Its fulfillment is, ultimately, a measure of the credibility of our multilateral system. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of El Salvador and give the floor to the representative of Maldives.
Thank you, President. I thank China, the President of the Council, for convening this annual open debate, as well as the briefers for their presentations. 10 years ago, this Council adopted Resolution 2286 on the protection of medical personnel and facilities in armed conflict. It demanded protection for the wounded and the sick, for medical and humanitarian workers, and for hospitals, ambulances, and other medical transport. That commitment is at the heart of the debate today, but it is also the measure of our own failure. In Palestine, the basic protections of international humanitarian law, including the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants, have eroded to the point of collapse. The Secretary General's report on the protection of civilians in armed conflict serves as evidence, but to no avail. In 2024, nearly 70% of all structures had been damaged or destroyed by the end of the year in Gaza. Around 1.9 million people, approximately 90% of the population, were internally displaced. 2024 was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian personnel, with more than 360 humanitarians killed, including at least 200 in Gaza. Year after year, the warning becomes louder, and year after year, this Council fails to act. This is the core test before us. Protection must not remain a word that is only spoken within this chamber. It must reach the civilians trapped under the bombardment, the patients without medicine, the humanitarian workers denied access, and the malnourished children left among the rubble of bombed hospitals. Today, the majority of Palestinian children remain displaced without access to adequate healthcare, water, sanitation, or nutrition. Over 43,000 Palestinians who survived Israel's indiscriminate attacks are living with life-changing injuries. Humanitarian operations remain constrained by Israel's restrictions, damaged roads, and destroyed infrastructure. During this month, only 1 in 2 aid trucks from Egypt could offload at the crossings controlled by Israel, and in the West Bank, settler violence continues to escalate. The Maldives calls for immediate, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access, and for the full respect for international law and international humanitarian law. Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and its impunity must end, and the Maldives reiterates its support for the Palestinian people's right to self-determination, the recognition of the independent state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital and full UN membership. Justice is indispensable. International humanitarian law cannot remain an empty promise without meaning or action. This Council must match its words with action. It must act to stop the killing, secure humanitarian access, ensure accountability, and uphold the dignity and rights of the Palestinian people. That is the only way protection will have any meaning, and I thank you.
I thank the representative of Maldives and now give the floor to the representative of Burundi.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Burundi congratulates the People's Republic of China on its presidency of the Security Council for May and looks forward to participating in this open debate on the protection of civilians. We commend the quality of the briefings given by Ms. Wosomo and Ms. Polyarik, who stressed the need for respect for and effective application of international humanitarian law in order to limit the suffering of civilians. Mr. President, the picture painted by the Secretary General's report is bleak. There are dozens of active conflicts, millions of civilians killed, wounded, and displaced. Vital infrastructure, hospitals, schools, water networks are deliberately targeted or destroyed without regard for consequences. Aid workers are attacked at record level. What we are describing is a result of a deliberate and gradual erosion of respect for the international humanitarian law. And this erosion cannot be explained by lack of rules. The rules we have, the conventions are ratified, resolutions were adopted. What is lacking is the will to apply them and the collective courage to punish those who violate them. We call on the Security Council to name the violations directly, to reject any policy of double standards, and to ensure that impunity does not become norm. In this regard, I would like to make a few observations that are particularly close to our hearts. First, the protection of humanitarian workers. For us in Burundi, any attack targeting humanitarians is a double attack against civilians. Attacks on humanitarian workers are now at record levels. 10 years after the adoption of Resolution 2286, the situation has worsened, and this is unacceptable. Burundi benefited from the courageous work of these men and women in the aftermath of the 1993 crisis and the assassination of our first democratically elected president. We know that what their presence means to communities in crisis. Their protection is not a technical issue. It's a moral and legal obligation that no party to a conflict can evade. Burundi calls for effective guarantees of humanitarian access as well as enhanced legal protection for field personnel. Similarly, those responsible for attacks on humanitarian personnel must be held accountable. Secondly, the protection of medical infrastructure. 10 years after the adoption of Resolution 2286, hospitals continue to be bombed. Medical staff continue to be targeted. The wounded and sick continue to be deprived of care. This situation is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and requires a commensurate response. We welcome the global initiative to strengthen political commitment to international humanitarian law launched jointly by several member states and ICRC, and which has already garnered the support of more than 100 countries. We encourage all states that have not yet done so to accede to it. Political commitments must be translated to behavior on the ground. Third, addressing the root causes of conflict. No sustainable protection of civilians is possible without conflict prevention, political resolution of crises, and sustainable development. Efforts to protect civilians must be part of a comprehensive approach combining preventive diplomacy, peace building, national capacity building, and support for fragile states. In this regard, peacekeeping operations play a key role in stabilizing crisis contexts and protecting vulnerable people. However, no protection action can have a lasting impact as long as cycles of violence, institutional instability, and the root causes of conflict persist. We call for enhanced support for African mechanisms for conflict prevention, mediation, and conflict management, as well as for predictable, sustainable, and adequate funding for peace operations mandated by the United Nations and the AU. Fourth, the challenges and opportunities related to new technologies. For us in Burundi, the rapid development of military applications of emerging technologies, drones, artificial intelligence, and autonomous systems, create new risks for civilians. The lack of a clear regulatory framework for autonomous weapon systems is a worrying gap. Military innovation cannot be developed to the detriment of international humanitarian law, and to that end, we advocate the full application of international humanitarian law to new technologies of warfare and the development of new international standards governing the use of artificial intelligence in armed conflict. These are the four messages that we wanted to convey to the Council today. In conclusion, Mr. President, the protection of civilians cannot remain a time-honored formula repeated year after year without an assessment of the actual progress made. It must be a living, concrete, and demanding commitment to which every member of this organization is bound to respond. I thank you.
感谢布隆迪。
I thank the representative of Burundi and give the floor to the representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Georgia attaches high importance to the protection of civilians in armed conflict and to full respect for international humanitarian law. This issue is particularly sensitive for us due to the ongoing occupation of Georgia's territories, Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions by the Russian Federation. As conflict-affected people continue to face serious humanitarian and human rights challenges, including restrictions on freedom of movement, illegal detentions, discrimination on ethnic grounds, and limitations on access to education in their native language. We believe that stronger respect for international humanitarian law remains essential for reducing civilian suffering in armed conflicts. In this regard, Georgia joined the global initiative to galvanize political commitment to international humanitarian law in November 2025, as we consider it a timely and important effort aimed at reinforcing political commitment to international humanitarian law and keeping the protection of civilians high on the international agenda. Georgia reiterates the importance of accountability and implementation of the existing international obligations, including the EU-mediated 12 August 2008 ceasefire agreement. We also underline the importance of the full implementation of the relevant Security Council resolutions related to the protection of civilians, including resolutions 2286 of 2016 and 2573 of 2021, particularly with regard to the protection of medical care and civilian infrastructure in armed conflict. Mr. President, Georgia remains firmly committed to the peaceful resolution of conflicts and has taken substantive steps towards supporting those living beyond the occupation line. We continue to provide vital medical, social and educational support to all conflict-affected populations with a clear sense that peace has no alternative. In closing, I would like to stress the importance of ensuring unhindered international monitoring and humanitarian access to the occupied territories of Georgia. We face a situation where the mandate of the EU monitoring mission covers the whole territory of Georgia, yet the mission is denied access to Abkhazia and Tkhinvali regions. This lack of access undermines transparency, limits international monitoring, and negatively affects the protection of conflict-affected populations. Mr. President, these challenges only strengthen our resolve. We will continue to engage actively with our international partners to protect civilians in conflict zones and remain firm in our belief that justice and a peaceful resolution will ultimately prevail. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Georgia and give the floor to the representative of Mali.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, it is my great honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the member countries of the Confederation of Sahel States, AES, namely Burkina Faso, the Republic of Mali, and the Republic of Niger. I extend warmest congratulations to the Chinese Presidency of the Security Council for organizing this open meeting, which is devoted to the protection of civilians in situations of armed conflict. This topic is of burning relevance for the three member countries of the AES, which have been fighting for several decades against terrorism, violent extremism, and other forms of transnational organized crime supported by foreign state sponsors. Terrorists and their foreign sponsors are primarily responsible for the deaths of thousands of our people, including women and children. In defiance of the law and the principles of humanity, these criminal groups target civilian populations, carrying out murder, looting, forced displacement of populations, ransacking and desecration of places of worship, looting and destruction of agricultural production, as well as the theft of livestock. They are also responsible for the destruction of civilian infrastructure, including schools, health centers, water, and energy facilities. They also attack economic activities and supply routes in our countries. To put an end to this transnational organized crime and create the conditions for sustainable development for the benefit of the Sahelian population, Their Excellencies Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Faso, Head of State, General of the Army Assimi Goïta, President of the Transition of Mali, Head of State, and General of the Army Abdurrahman Tiani, President of the Republic of Niger, Head of State, have decided in full sovereignty to pool their efforts of the three countries in the fields of defense, diplomacy, and development. Thus, under their leadership, the fighting forces of the member states of the Confederation, as well as its united force, remain committed day and night to ensuring the protection of children, women, and the elderly, civilian victims of the barbaric and criminal abuses of these terrorists and their foreign state sponsors. With honor and professionalism, these men and women fight at the cost of their lives to guarantee all populations without distinction the enjoyment of their basic rights, including the right to life. I would like to pay a heartfelt tribute to our confederated forces for their commitment and sacrifice. In such a context, the AES Confederation strongly condemns all the false narratives devised by certain media outlets of imperial countries, which have become relays of terrorist propaganda and which are working to discredit the integrity, professionalism, and rigor of the soldiers of the Sahel. These media lies are silent, curiously, about the daily successes that our defense and security forces have over these forces of evil. We call for an immediate end to this daily media terrorism of which our countries and our populations are victims. We also call for the sources of financing of terrorism, including the payment of ransoms for the release of hostages, to be dried up. The AES Confederation once again denounces the subversive agenda of some member states of the UN, whose ultimate goal is to reimpose their hegemony in our countries. The Confederation pays special attention to civilian and military victims of terrorism. Each of its member states has strategies and programs in place to assist affected populations, including refugees and internally displaced persons. In this regard, we welcome the Security Council statement to the press of 15 May 2026, in which your Council clearly condemns the coordinated terrorist attacks against several Malian cities on the 25th of April 2026 and expresses its compassion and solidarity with Mali, its people, and its authorities. The message of the AES Confederation is unequivocal. Our countries remain standing and determined to fight international terrorism. We remain committed to the protection of our civilian populations under all circumstances and in compliance with our international commitments, in particular in the field of human rights and international humanitarian law. I conclude by paying tribute to all the victims of terrorism, Sahelian and foreign, civilian and military, with a special thought for the victims of the events of the 25th April 2026 in Mali. I salute the admirable resilience of the people of the Sahel in the face of the difficult situation that our countries are going through. And finally, I reaffirm the determination of the member states of the AES Confederation to combat terrorism and violent extremism in our common space. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mali for the statement. I now give the floor to the United Republic of Tanzania.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening this important debate on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. I also thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. The United Republic of Tanzania reaffirms that the protection of civilians remains central to the maintenance of international peace and security. Today, the world is witnessing more than 120 armed conflicts, with civilians, particularly women and children, continuing to bear the heaviest burden through injury, death, forced displacement, sexual violence, hunger, and destruction of livelihood and civil infrastructure. Across many conflict situations, attacks on hospitals, schools, water systems, and humanitarian operations have deprived millions of access to healthcare, education, food, clean water, and other essential services. 10 years after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2286 on the protection of healthcare in conflict, Tanzania remains deeply concerned by continued attacks against medical personnel and facilities, in clear violation of international humanitarian law. We reiterate that all parties to armed conflict must comply fully with their obligations under international law, particularly the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Civilians must never be targeted, and humanitarian and medical personnel must be protected and allowed to operate safely and without obstruction. Mr. President, Tanzania is also concerned by the growing use of explosive weapons in populated areas and the increasing use of emerging technologies in warfare, including artificial intelligence-enabled systems and cyber capabilities. Technological advancement must not outpace accountability, human dignity, and compliance with international humanitarian law. The increasing normalization of violations, inconsistent standards, and selective application of international law risk undermining confidence in the international system and weakening global respect for humanitarian norms. Tanzania emphasized that sustainable protection of civilians cannot be achieved through military means alone. The root causes of conflict, including poverty, inequality, exclusion, terrorism, illicit arms flows, and competition over resources, must be addressed through inclusive political dialogue, development, and strengthened regional cooperation, including African Union and regional mechanisms. Tanzania also stressed the importance of protecting humanitarian space and ensuring safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access to populations in need. In conclusion, Tanzania reaffirms its commitment to constructive engagement in advancing peace, security, and the protection of civilians worldwide. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Republic of Tanzania and now give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
نشكر الرئاسة الصينية على عقد هذه المناقشة.
We would like to thank the Chinese presidency for organizing this open debate. President, we're meeting here today as we see a worsening of violations affecting civilians throughout the world. And that is why we need to strengthen the protection of civilians and guarantee respect for international humanitarian law. The problem is not a lack of resolutions by this Council, but it has much more to do with their implementation and them being respected. Today, we're seeing crises in Sudan, Gaza, DRC, Ukraine, and in our region as well. And we see the growing gap between legal commitments and reality on the ground. And in the light of the violations committed against civilians and civilian infrastructure, there is no accountability, there is impunity. This debate is taking place at a time when civilians in my country are being attacked under armed Iranian attack that is unjust. We're seeing violations of all customs and all international rules. And since the 28th of February last, Iran launched thousands of drones and missiles attacking my country, the UAE, and neighboring countries, targeting systematically civilian infrastructure, including commercial ports, airports, and energy facilities and communication networks, as well as food distribution centers and food production centers. More than 20,000 people today are trapped in the Straits of Hormuz on ships. This is a serious and flagrant violation of international law. The hindrances to maritime navigation in the Straits of Hormuz is a serious violation, the consequences of which go beyond the region. Indeed, energy supplies, food supplies today are threatened. This Council adopted Resolution 2817, calling for an end to these attacks and for the protection of civilians and international navigation. However, these violations continue, and Iran continues to disregard this resolution. The United Arab Emirates remains committed to protect our civilian population, but the question to be asked is, what is this Council doing to guarantee the effective implementation of these resolutions and to preserve its credibility? In this regard, we support the draft resolution proposed by the Kingdom of Bahrain and the United States of America for the protection of maritime traffic in the Straits of Hormuz, which was co-sponsored by 138 member states. This support sends out a clear message, namely that the international community refuses to accept this Iranian behavior and the targeting of civilians and the threat to international shipping and to the world economy. Mr. President, this week the Security Council has held an emergency meeting following a drone attack targeting the Barak energy station in the United Arab Emirates. That attack was a direct threat for civilians and for regional nuclear security. The peaceful nuclear facilities must not be the object of attacks or used to escalate a situation. In conclusion, the protection of civilians requires specific measures to be taken by the Security Council, ensuring the implementation of its resolutions, guaranteeing accountability, and by using the means at its disposal, particularly the sanctions system. And we call upon the 1737 committee, as well as its panel of experts, to make good use of the sanctions system, particularly in the light of this Iranian aggression in our region. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.